products that you could make money off of. And so all these...
That's so crazy. Oh, it's so disturbing. People are gross. Oh, they're awesome too. Like a lot of people, you're awesome. A lot of people are awesome. A lot of people are great. I love them. But like in large groups, when they don't have responsibility for their actions, they're gross.
A primary smelter is to melt rock. You know, it was like taking the rocks from mines that were full of all these different metals, you know, including arsenic. This is where the arsenic came from. But they were full of metals like, you know, lead and copper and silver and gold, and melting those rocks in these giant furnaces.
That I don't read any of this stuff late at night.
Yeah.
You know, when I read stuff like this late at night, I can't go to sleep. I freak out. It just disturbs me. Human beings, their capacity to do things like this, either knowingly or unknowingly, and then to cover it up knowingly, and then to try to find some way to profit off of the removal of it or the treatment of these ailments that these people suffer, and then the obfuscating and the, you know, diverting the attention to some other thing, like calling it a disease or calling it something else.
Yeah, there was a whole map, a GIS map, geographic, you know, information systems that allowed you to look up individual houses, you know, residential homes in Tacoma, and see how much arsenic and lead pollution was in the yards. So I discovered that you could actually look up the house where Ted Bundy grew up and see how much lead was in his front yard and his backyard. And the more I read about lead pollution and lead, the association with aggression and violence, the more I wondered, is there a story to be told here?
So this issue of lead pollution, is it just serial killers, or is there an elevated amount of violent crime that goes along with it?
Yeah, the issue of serial killers is one that I kind of introduced as a, you know, the most extreme example.
Right.
But most of the research that's been done has focused on aggression, juvenile delinquency, for example. There are long-term studies that look at kids who were exposed to lead, including in relatively small amounts, and then what happens to them later, you know, by the time they're, you know, teenagers or young adults. And they have shown a very strong association with, you know, problems with learning, ADHD, and as I said, delinquency and crime.
And they've even shown that in places that don't have smelters, where people are just dealing with leaded gasoline that was used up until the 1990s, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, decrease in IQ, a lot of factors that they can directly tie into just the lead from gasoline, which is significantly less than I would assume you'd get from a large-scale smelting operation.
Yeah, and the leaded gas is particularly tragic because that was essentially a kind of horrific experiment that was conducted on generations of kids in this country.
Yeah.
And adults, because everybody was exposed to that. Obviously, some people more than others. If you lived next to a major highway or something like that, you were getting more of it than if you maybe lived somewhere else. Although I think rural people were also exposed because of the kinds of machinery and stuff that's used on farms and so forth. It was a terrible idea, and they knew that at the time. You know, Standard Oil, DuPont, etc. They knew the dangers of this. They were told by medical doctors who said, this will expose everybody to more lead than human beings have ever had to deal with before.
Wow.
And
they just did it to stop the engines from knocking.
They did, and apparently there were alternatives, but the alternatives, which were like ethanol, were not something that could be patented and were not products that you could make money off of. And so all these corporations chose to do this.
Oh, God.
Yeah. I mean, it's really almost unreal to think about the moral failure that this failure doesn't even seem strong enough.
It doesn't. It's so evil. It's so strange how many times that has happened in human history and in fairly recent history, where companies know what they're putting out or what they're releasing or what they're prescribing or whatever it is going to damage people. And they know that short term they can make a lot of money, and so they do it anyway.
For decades, because this began in the 20s and 30s.
So we can assume that the smelting thing they probably didn't know, correct? Like at least in the 1800s.
Yeah, in the 1800s, they probably weren't thinking about stuff like that. They didn't have data on it. But smelter in Tacoma was owned by a company called Asarco, which was the American smelting and refining company, owned by the Guggenheim family.
Oh, boy.
But
they've done so much for art.
Yeah, I mean, it's just...
That's what they like to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a total kind of whitewashing the reputation.
Yeah. So dark. My friend Peter Berg explained to me the origins of the Nobel Prize. Did you know the origins of the Nobel Prize?
To do with explosives, right?
Yes. The gentleman who the Nobel Prize is named after, they erroneously reported that he was dead in the newspaper. And they called him the Merchant of Death in the newspaper. And you're like, oh, my God, this is what people think about me because he invented dynamite. And so he's like, I've got to do something to clean up my reputation. So he devised this strategy of awarding this prestigious award named after him to all the great scientists and Nobel Peace Prize and all these different things. So now when people hear the term Nobel, like, oh, he's a Nobel laureate. Oh, he's a Nobel Prize winner. And that's the origin of it.
I mean, the same thing happened with the guy who invented the leaded gas formula, Thomas Midgley, who was really a terrible guy. I mean, he invented the leaded gas stuff. He also invented chlorofluorocarbons, the stuff in refrigerants that cause the
ozone layer hole?
The hole in the ozone layer.
Oh, terrific.
So like two of the most devastating scientific discoveries in the 20th century are down to this guy. And he was awarded the, highest medal from the, American Chemistry Association. He became really ill as a result, I think, of working with this, tetraethyl, it's called, the substance that was added to leaded gas. And he, went to Florida to try and heal himself of this, which I don't think you can do. I mean, I don't think going to Florida heals lead exposure. But he developed something which was called polio. He became, unable to walk, and he invented this whole bizarre kind of system of pulleys that he could use to lift himself out of bed, and eventually he strangled to death in this sort of harness thing, which it may have been suicide, it may have been an accident.
Wow. So when you first started investigating this, was your interest in serial killers? You always had an interest in serial killers, which is always weird to me how many women are interested in serial killers. Like all of the top true crime podcasts, if you look at their demographics, it's a large chunk of it is women. And I know the women in my house love to watch those true crime shows. And those serial killer, which it disturbs the shit out of me. Like my family was watching something on The Night Stalker, on Richard Ramirez, and I can't watch this. I can't watch. I get sick. And I can't watch it. They're like fascinated. Like, why is that? Why do you think women are so interested? I'm not like lumping you in with all women, but there is a weird thing.
I think that has to do with the fact that women deal with fear. Fear. It may be very, nebulous. It may be kind of unclear what, but a lot of women have just had the experience of being afraid walking alone at night, or, or they've had direct experience of, some kind of male violence or aggression, at home, domestic violence. So I think there's a whole gamut of experiences that women have had to one extent or another that feed into that. And for me, it was growing up, just a couple of miles from the places where Ted Bundy began abducting women in winter and summer of 1974. And everybody knew there was somebody out there. This is at a time when the term serial killer wasn't even really in use yet. People didn't really understand the phenomenon. Women were disappearing from dorm rooms or their rooms at University of Washington. They were disappearing off the street, and then they weren't seen again for weeks, for months. In the July of 1974, I was 13, and on a really hot, Sunday afternoon in 1974, 2 women disappeared from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish, which was about, 10 minutes from my house. Really wanted to understand what was happening.
So did you plan on writing a book about serial killers?
Yeah, I never really wanted to write a book that was just about serial killers. I mean, I think that's been done,
Right.
And lots of people have done that and done a good job, I mean, Anne Rule, the woman who wrote the first book about Ted Bundy, who knew Ted Bundy.
Oh, she knew him.
Yes, she worked with him at a rape crisis clinic.
Oh my
in
God.
Seattle. Yeah,
He worked at a rape crisis clinic. Wow.
he was very interested in doing research on rape.
Wow.
Because of course he was something of an expert. Was why that book was such a phenomenon, because she knew him before anybody had identified, anything in him. She liked him. She was friends with him.
Wow.
She gave him, a ride to the Christmas party.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Was this while he was killing or before he started?
We don't really know about Ted Bundy is when he started killing. He would never answer that question. And one of the cases of an 8-year-old girl who was abducted in Tacoma in 1961, in August of 1961, Anne Marie Burr. And he was 14 at that time. And he is now one of the principal suspects, I think, behind her abduction.
Oh, wow.
So that may have been his first
14.
murder.
Was there like a history of him torturing animals or anything along those lines?
No, but one of the things that I think the FBI was discovering when they started doing all this, investigation of the pasts, the childhood of serial killers, was that this starts really young, that the fantasies and the obsessions with, or kill
Right.
the family pets and
Yeah.
so forth. With Ted, that wasn't the case. I think with him, one of the things you see is that he never knew who his father was. He was born illegitimate at a foundling home in Vermont, and his mother left him there for a couple of months before she went back and kind of retrieved him. A very bad relationship with the parents. There's maybe abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. We don't know that about Ted Bundy in terms of the abuse factor, but he talked a lot about, various people were able to interview him. The detective in King County in Seattle who was in charge of the investigation, he was actually quite young when he took this on. I think it was his first major case as a detective. He eventually was able to interview Ted Bundy in prison when he was on death row. Bundy, for a variety of reasons, wouldn't talk about anything that he did except hypothetically in the third person because he was still trying to work the legal system. And so he didn't want to admit to what he'd done. It was sort of like O.J. Simpson or something. He would say, well, if somebody was going to do this, here's what he probably would have done. And so there was a lot of that up until the very last days of Bundy's sojourn on death row. And then he finally began confessing in the last 2 or 3 days in an attempt, I think, to get the governor interested in perhaps extending his life because he could give information about where bodies had been left and so forth. But that didn't convince the governor of Florida.
What did you find? Like, is there a disproportionate number of serial killers that come from that particular area?
Yeah, there really are, as I discovered, a really kind of extraordinary number. And it's hard to talk about these numbers simply because we don't know what a normal number of serial killers in a given population.
Get caught? So are there like undiscovered serial killers that are in that area, or maybe deaths that are attributed to unknown people?
There are several cases that have never been resolved. There's something called the dismemberment murders up in the Northwest where, various feet and things were found washing up on shore and nobody could figure out who they belonged to. Bodies of people who drowned, because that's, I think, what happens in some cases in Idaho that they've never solved. So there are those cases, but even aside from those, I spent a lot of time looking at the year 1974 because it seemed really active in terms of what was happening with serial killers around the country and in the Northwest. And it was famously the year when Bundy really kind of broke free of any restraints he might have once had and began abducting women basically kind of like once a month. And in 1974, I found at least 6 active serial killers in Seattle or along the I-5 corridor who were all kind of working at the same time.
Wow.
And that seems like a lot to me. And just looking at Tacoma, the rate of violent crime really skyrocketed in 1974 and in the mid-'70s. It's just started going up and up and up. And you see this, unfortunately, across the country. The rate of violent crime in the 70s and 80s rose to heights that had not been seen before.
Like, why 1974?
Well, there are various theories that have been put forth. People have pointed out that in the mid-'70s was when the baby boom generation, which was, large in terms of its population density, that those people had started to kind of come of age. They'd entered the period when you're most likely to commit crimes, which is your 20s or 30s. And so There was that. There was a lot of economic uncertainty. There was a recession. Nixon, was in the White House early on in the 70s. There was the Vietnam War. There had been a lot of violence during the 60s. I think also, based on the science that's being done, you do need to look at the toxins that were becoming really, really prevalent. The lead, cadmium is another heavy metal that's very similar to lead in the body in terms of its association with aggression. Zinc, manganese, all these things were being...
Zinc?
Yeah.
Zinc is associated with aggression?
It's one of these things that was forming the exposure to particulate pollution, which is now associated with all kinds of health problems, heart problems. I mean, lead is a toxin. It's a poison. Yeah. And so you put it in the body and it becomes, it's very easy for that to reach your brain. And what happens is that, especially if you're exposed to a lot of this stuff, you can be sick in all kinds of ways. You can get heart problems. It's now been associated with various forms of dementia, Alzheimer's, ALS. So there's a lot of things that lead can cause, but they have shown statistically that the increase in lead in the population, in the air, in the mid-70s, really may have contributed to a rise in violent crime. Depression, of course, in the 1930s. So there's not a lot of driving happening in terms of the what we see now. I mean, yeah, it just wasn't as big of a deal. It was, rare to have one car, much less, 2 or 3. And then during the war, you had... World War II is really interesting to look at in terms of lead because gasoline, of course, was rationed. They needed all of it for the war effort. But the war effort itself raised the amount of metals, all these metals, lead, copper, et cetera, were needed so intensively for the war that they began to be produced more than at any other time in world history. And so the pollution from that, from producing all these, tanks and vehicles and planes and everything that they needed was really going to form the basis of what would become the Superfund program. Stuff started entering the environment. And once it's there, it's really hard to get rid of it. That's the problem with lead. It doesn't wash away. It doesn't go anywhere. It just hangs around and becomes, part of our environment. After the war, people started driving lots and lots more, in the 50s and 60s. This country particularly was doing really well economically, and everybody was buying cars and driving them for the first time, en masse. And so,
in human history. I have a friend who briefly lived in Brooklyn, and he had a very small backyard that he was going to try to grow some plants in, grow a small garden. But he did some soil samples. He's a very, very intelligent guy. Did some soil samples and sent it to university to get it tested. And it was just filled with lead. And he was like, what is this all about? And they was like, it's all from leaded gasoline. So this was in the 2000s. So I think this was around 2012, 2013. And they had told him there's a few things that you could do. There's certain plants that you could grow that would remove some of it from the soil other than completely excavating and replacing it with fresh soil. But his whole backyard was essentially lead poisoned. Is there an uptick in violence in these areas where they were making stuff for the war effort, where they would be polluting the area?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely see, what happened in Tacoma is very well recorded now. Another city where this happened was El Paso, Texas, because Asarco had another major smelter in El Paso that had started in the 1890s and had been spewing this stuff out for decades. But all of the smelters during the war were kind of, they weren't taken over by the government, but the government introduced all kinds of, price fixing and so forth to make it not possible for these companies to raise prices. In El Paso, by the 1970s, they were starting to discover that this whole area around the smokestack of the smelter was heavily lead contaminated. And what I thought, well, El Paso, that's interesting. But there were no serial killers in El Paso. And so I Googled that. And within a minute, I discover that Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, grew up in El Paso, not very far from the smelter. And, we associate him now with Los Angeles because that's where he committed most of his murders, but he did not grow up there.
Wow. It's also tied to the sexual revolution. I mean, and then also, when was birth control, like oral birth control, introduced?
I think that was in the 1960s, early 60s. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there is some...
There's a bunch of other factors. It's not like we can pin everything on lead and arsenic.
That's right.
But there's contributing factors.
And of course, people, always point out, well, not everybody in Tacoma and El Paso became a serial killer,
right.
Which of course is true.
Well, it's like what you're talking about, Ted Bundy. There's a bunch of factors that lead this person to becoming that. But
right.
Also lead.
Yeah. I mean, a little extra lead, may have been something that, maybe they had a lot of other factors to begin with, abuse, poverty. Babies were delivered with forceps, which caused brain damage in a certain percentage of kids. So you're looking at a lot of different things that contributed to trauma to the brain. I think now they're really focusing on that, in terms of CTE and, brain damage. We see that now in football players who've had head trauma repeatedly, that this can cause violence and aggression.
And impulsivity.
Right.
A huge issue.
Yeah. Not making great decisions about what you're doing.
The gas thing, the lead in the gas thing is just crazy. It's just crazy to know that was all done because someone couldn't patent ethanol. They couldn't patent other formulations that would lead to the same result, but wouldn't be as profitable for this person.
Yeah, these smelters is that they would kind of fail, or the filters would fail. There's this horrifying example in Idaho. It was a company called Bunker Hill that was one of the largest silver mines, I think, in the world. And they had a lead smelter in this town called Kellogg, which is right on I-90. If you've ever driven on I-90, from Missoula, Montana or something like that to Seattle. They built, this giant smelter facility to handle all the stuff they were pulling out of the mines. And in 1973, they had a fire in their filtration building that destroyed most of the filter. That was the thing that was supposed to keep lead from going up the smokestack. There was an elementary school right across the street from the smokestack.
Jesus.
And the descriptions of that school are so horrifying because the teachers used to think that sometimes that the facility had caught fire because there was so much smoke.
Oh, God.
But in fact, there wasn't, It was just what the smokestack was putting out. But after that company, which was owned by Gulf and Western at the time, did a kind of back-of-the-napkin calculation of what those kids' lives were worth, because they felt like, okay, we're going to get sued if we keep running the plant without filtration, but is that really going to matter? Because these kids' lives are probably only worth about $11 million apiece.
Oh, my God.
And our profits are such that it makes more sense to keep operating regardless.
Oh, my God.
And we know this because of the lawsuits that were ultimately filed, because, you know, they did end up in court.
The fire broke out that destroyed the filters. It says, for the next year and a half, the smelter continued to operate, and dust polluted with heavy metals rained down on the area. During that time, children living in the area were screened for lead by the state and the U.S. Center for Disease Control, and the results were foreboding. Children in Kellogg, for example, averaged 50 micrograms per deciliter of blood. The CDC recommends 5 micrograms, high enough to warrant concern. And children with levels above 45 micrograms are advised to undergo chelation therapy, which involves administering compounds like, I don't know how to say that word. How do you say that word?
I don't know.
Dimercaptosacinic acid, either orally or intravenously, to remove heavy metals from the bloodstream. Lead is a neurotoxin linked to schizophrenia, poor academic performance, low cognitive ability, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Once the metal gets into the blood, it concentrates in the brain, the kidneys, the liver, and the bones. In pregnant women, lead can cross into the placenta, poisoning their unborn babies. Holy shit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was a nightmarish thing. And
look at this. It says, oh my God. The Silver King School, built in 1928 in the gulch between the Bunker Hill lead smelter and zinc plant, an offshoot of the Coeur d'Alene River, flowed by the school. It was, says Flory, a light glowing green color, sort of a glow, like a glow stick. Oh God, that is so disgusting. It's so hard to believe that that's how people operate, but yet I know they do.
yeah, I mean, it's murder.
Yeah.
And that's why I called it Murderland. You know, I think that the behavior of these corporate actors was as bad. I mean, it's, you know, maybe pernicious to compare, but I think that, you know, people have come to see that the ways that corporations have behaved is murderous.
Also, they lie.
They
So
lie.
whatever they're going to tell us. I mean, we've found this out from pharmaceutical drug companies that when they run studies, they'll run 10 studies that show damage, and they'll find one study that they can kind of manipulate into showing some sort of efficacy, and then they'll publish that one study and bury the other studies that show damage, and then release a product, and then have internal emails where they show that they know that this is going to cause problems. And this is the issue with the drug Vioxx that wound up killing somewhere in the neighborhood of 60,000 Americans. And I know people don't like to equate those people with serial killers, but what else would you call if you know that you're going to kill people,
Yeah.
but you're also going to make money, and you decide, let's do it anyway.
Right.
Let's do it anyway.
Yeah.
Let's make some money. And 60,000 people die because of it. And then who knows how many people also survived but got strokes.
In Tacoma, there was a guy, a doctor at the smelter, who wrote false papers saying that, oh, the workers aren't being harmed by exposure to arsenic, when in fact his numbers showed that people who worked at the plant were dying of an elevated percentage of lung cancer. And he suppressed that information. He said, you know, their deaths were from heart failure, which everybody dies of heart failure, you know. So he basically was falsifying the information from their death certificates and publishing papers, you know, designed to make it look like arsenic wasn't a poison. Stuff that they were producing at the smelter in Tacoma was what's called inorganic arsenic. And that's the stuff they used to poison rats.
Ugh.
And they used it for insecticides and very heavily during the 40s and 50s, they were putting it all over apple orchards and cherry orchards and cotton crops contaminated with arsenic. And Washington State now has 4 plumes of this pollution. The big one was in Puget Sound from the smelter, which was like 1,000 square miles of Puget Sound that was contaminated. But also Wenatchee, which is over in eastern Washington, where they have all these apple orchards. There's another plume there from those pesticides and insecticides.
Ugh.
And there's a plume up in Everett where there was what they called an arsenic kitchen. The Rockefellers used to own mines up in the Cascade Mountains. And they had a smelter in Everett that was then bought by the Guggenheims, and they moved their arsenic kitchen to Tacoma. But it left all this pollution in Everett. And so they discovered, all these people had built houses and condos and things on top of where the arsenic kitchen had been, which, that stuff was never cleaned up. And so they had to remediate. So-called.
This term remediation.
In Tacoma, what they did, that was where the worst of the pollution was, because the smokestack was sitting right, near the water. The smokestack was blown up in the 90s, and
blown up?
Yeah, they exploded the smokestack, which I'm
on purpose.
Yeah, they closed the plant in 1986.
Oh, so it's a controlled demolition?
Yeah, so it was yes, exactly.
Which also probably contributed greatly to more pollutants.
Yeah. They claimed that they cleaned the inside of the smokestack. But
before they blew it up?
Yeah,
oh,
but they carted away tons of soil. They took, they went into people's yards, they tested all of the yards and told people, okay, you're going to have to replace the soil. And so, they went in and by this point, Asarco had declared bankruptcy and the EPA eventually had to take over the whole thing. But the EPA got an unprecedented environmental bankruptcy settlement out of Asarco, which was close to $2 billion. But it had to clean up about 20 different Superfund sites, including the one in Idaho in Coeur d'Alene, which they've been working on that for years and still haven't finished. But in Tacoma, they actually did replace the soil in many, many people's yards. But they run out of money. I mean, I think on places like Vashon, a lot of that was on the southern part. I think you could request soil replacement in some of these places, but it wasn't necessarily guaranteed, depending on where you live. They have to take that soil somewhere. So
right.
In Tacoma, they took it to some special landfill. But, I mean, one of the really crazy things that happened as a result of closing the smokestack there was that they took that arsenic kitchen that I was talking about, the one that had been up in Everett, and some of the most contaminated parts of the buildings that were part of the whole smelter compound. And Asarco promised that they were going to take all that stuff and put it somewhere else. I don't know where they were going to put it, but they said they were going to take it. But then they went bankrupt, and so they didn't remove it. And instead they created this very bizarre kind of pit where they put all the worst stuff, including a bunch of the soil, the contaminated soil from Everett and the arsenic kitchen, and they put it in a sort of super heavy-duty plastic-lined, garbage bag, essentially. I mean, if you can imagine, like, the largest garbage bag in the world. They put all this stuff in it, and they capped it with soil, and that thing is sitting there, still, even and they built condos on top of that.
Oh my God. Do they tell the people that live in these condos what they're dealing with?
Well, there's a very small historical display with some photographs and materials about the smelter that's in one of the buildings on the way to the public bathroom.
Oh my God.
This. So presumably, if the people who are buying condos there know anything about it, they put up. I mean, but
in a sense. But also, doesn't it leak into the water table?
Well, they have a lot of stuff that they've done. I mean, in the book, I talk about Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune.
Mm-hmm.
He was from Tacoma.
Oh.
And in fact, the stuff in Dune about the pollution and what has happened to the planet, that he dramatized, a lot of that came from his disgust with the smelter. And a planet that had basically destroyed its whole environment. Developed this whole little park on one, the condos are on one end of this, what used to be the smelter property, and then on the other end, on top of this slag land. The slag is the stuff that's left over after you've pulled all the metal out of the rocks. There's the stuff, really gravel. I mean, it's contaminated with all the stuff. It's contaminated with arsenic. And so they built a park that's called Dune Park, and it's dedicated to Frank Herbert. And it's this little walking trail. And the whole thing, I think, is developed in such a way that it's kind of lined with plastic. And there's a plastic liner, on the shores to keep stuff from leaking out. And like if you live in one of those condos, you can't plant anything that will be larger than a, small shrub, in part because of the plastic liner thing.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's wild.
That's so crazy. Oh, it's so disturbing. And then there's so many factors too, right? There's the plants, and then there's the industrial pesticides, the ubiquitous use of DDT, and how so many people in rural communities were coming down with, in air quotes, polio, paralytic polio, that was directly correlated to the use of DDT. Like the same areas where people, and it wasn't just human beings that were getting this polio, but it was also cows and horses and dogs. They were getting paralyzed as well, which it doesn't cross species. Human-derived polio does not cross species. You want to hear something crazy? What percentage of polio do you think is asymptomatic?
I've never heard that there's polio that's asymptomatic.
95 to 99%. 95 to 99% of actual polio is asymptomatic. So what they were calling polio was most likely DDT poisoning.
Wow.
That was sprayed everywhere. That was sprayed everywhere for gypsy moths and all sorts of different pests. They didn't know. And then once they did know, it was too late. And they were just trying to cover it up and say, no, we cured polio. We cured it. Look. And these people that were getting air quotes polio were most likely getting poisoned by DDT.
Yeah, I think that a lot of this environmental stuff has become so overwhelming to people that they kind of tune it out.
Yes.
It's like, what are we going to do about it?
Right.
There's nothing we can do. So
right.
Let's just pretend it's not happening.
I make sure that I don't read any of this stuff late at night.
Yeah.
When I read stuff like this late at night, I can't go to sleep. I freak out. It just disturbs me, human beings, their capacity to do things like this, either knowingly or unknowingly, and then to cover it up knowingly, and then to try to find some way to profit off of the removal of it or the treatment of these ailments that these people suffer, and then the obfuscating and the diverting the attention to some other thing, like calling it a disease or calling it something else.
I think people are interested in the history of how they might have been, exposed.
Sure.
When I did a reading up in Seattle a month or so ago, everybody was talking about where they grew up in relation to the smelter, like how close they were to it, and what they might have experienced as a result. And that, I think, is one of the interesting things about the Tacoma story, is that many poor people were directly exposed. The people who worked at the smelter, they lived right around the smokestack, so they got the worst of it. They lived on a street that was close to I-90 and was actually kind of ran over the top of a tunnel that enclosed I-90 on part of the island. And down the street from where I grew up was growing up another young guy named George Waterfield Russell, who turned out to be a serial killer. And in the 1990s, killed 3 women on the east side, where Bellevue is. You don't expect serial killers to come from that kind of a neighborhood. Not very far away from where Russell grew up, this other guy was also, who went to my high school, as did Russell, was growing up, who became one of the worst arsonists in Seattle history when he burned down his parents' warehouse and killed several Seattle firefighters. There was a guy in my class at the high school who was obsessed with his ex-girlfriend and he worked at a facility that used dynamite, and he stole some dynamite and blasting caps, and he went and blew up her dorm building. And there was another kid who went to my junior high who decided he was so depressed he was going to kill himself, and he drove his car at like 100 miles an hour. It actually wasn't his car. It was like his girlfriend's sister's Camaro. And he drove it, at 1,000,000 miles an hour into the wall of the junior high gymnasium and destroyed the gymnasium. So all this stuff is happening, in a period of time and in a place that you wouldn't think would have that level of crime.
And that kind of crime.
And that kind of crime.
And oddly enough, always men.
Yeah.
Which are uniquely affected by these things. But what about the women that were there? Was there bizarre behavior?
One of the things that I remember about the high school, for example, was, that there was a lot of kind of creepy behavior, going on in terms of food fights and just a lot of stuff I don't think you see as much now. This is completely anecdotal, so I can't support any of this, but it felt to me like when my niece and nephew were growing up that they were less troubled as youths, than we were in the 1970s. They were growing up in the 90s.
Totally makes sense. If there were elevated levels of all this lead, elevated levels of all these toxins, and we know that it affects human behavior, it only makes sense.
It does, and I hope urge people to just think about this in their lives, and I think a lot of people are now much more aware of lead, the amount of lead that's safe in terms of exposure, and they know that. I think if the federal government comes out and says it's 0, then that triggers all kinds of things that have to happen, and it makes parents freak out because, they might take their child to a doctor and have them tested and find out there's some, if it's not 0, then what are we going to do about it?
Right.
And it's,
And who's liable?
That's right.
Yeah. That's what's so disturbing about all this stuff, is that a lot of effort is put forth to make sure that whatever companies that may be liable, they'll try to distort facts and try to hide evidence and try to make it seem like this is a nothing burger. This is no big deal. Well, you see that with fluoride, and under the guise of improving dental health, which is just crazy because you don't need it. Like, you could just brush your teeth and stop eating so much fucking sugar, which is really the culprit. That's really 100% the culprit. I mean, if you go back to ancient times, one of the things they've seen, they find skulls and dead people's teeth from hundreds of years ago. You don't find a massive amount of tooth decay because people weren't eating a lot of sugar. They weren't constantly eating candy and stuff that rots your fucking teeth out. We don't need to. We don't need to put this neurotoxin into water. We need to stop eating poison. It's like really simple. You don't add a poison to make you better because there's more poison. Like, it's really crazy. And these are like hardcore facts. This is not something that's deniable. Like, if you look at the correlation between fluoride and lowered IQs, it's pretty undeniable. They know it's a fact. They know it's a neurotoxin. But yet they'll brush it off. Oh, but that's in high doses. In low doses. It's like, well, who's determining? Who's determining? It's fairly recent. So why are we putting it in toothpaste in the first place? Like, help me out. You're just trying to clean teeth, right? Like, why do you have to use fluoride? Well, you don't. That's why they sell fluoride-free toothpaste, and they advertise it as such. If fluoride was a thing that was helping everyone with tooth decay, why the hell would anybody want to buy fluoride-free toothpaste? Well, because people who have been actually paying attention and reading independent journalists and reading people that have gone outside the mainstream narrative that realize, like, this is not good for you. It probably should have been removed from our water supply a long time ago. So who's responsible? And then it gets into that. It gets into, like, these corporations that have been dumping fluoride into the water or justifying the use of fluoride, the politicians that have been doing it. Who's been getting paid? What's the paper trail? Like, what's going on? And it's just one more piece of disgusting.
Government is not, completely blameless in all of this either, because, in terms of lead, for example, one of the places that I think people are really concerned about is the schools, public schools. Public school buildings were built, often decades ago. So they're old and they have old plumbing. They have lead pipes.
Lead paint.
Lead paint.
Which is even crazier, that they use lead in paint.
Yeah. And so there's, there are real questions about how much the government is going to be on the hook for replacing all of this stuff that has to happen, which is, so much money in order to do that. And, they have occasionally kind of tiptoed up to this. I think the Biden administration did say that they were going to spend, millions of dollars to try and do work at schools. Kind of a frightening period right now because the EPA is being defunded in a lot of ways. I'm sure the EPA is not a perfect agency. I'm sure they've made mistakes, but they're the ones.
I'm sure they've been compromised, but also someone should be looking into this.
Yes.
And you're going to need some sort of an environmental group that is responsible and just, that can look at these things and say, hey, this is a real issue. And all of our health is dependent upon them doing a really good job of sussing this stuff out.
It's the EPA that's responsible for the Superfund program, which is in large part responsible for cleaning this stuff up. But they're being defunded, and so who's going to do that? Who's going to clean up, the areas that have